Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 124 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Today we'll be speaking with legendary writer and comedian John Cleese, who helped create the classic geek films Monty Python and the Holy Grail and Monty Python's Life of Brian. He also wrote and starred in the TV show Fawlty Towers and the feature film A Fish Called Wanda, and has appeared more recently in various Harry Potter, James Bond, and Shrek films. His new memoir, So Anyway, is out now. And now, here's our interview with John Cleese. All right, so we're here with John Cleese. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Okay, so the name of the show is Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, so obviously we're big Douglas Adams fans. And in your book, you talk about how you and Graham Chapman may have inspired Douglas Adams to put the number 42 into Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Could you tell us about that?
Well, I was curious about it because the only time we've ever used the number as a punchline for a sketch was a sketch that Graham Chapman and I wrote in 1962, which was a parody of a Church of England sermon, which finished with the punchline 42, and I was amused later to discover that Douglas Adams had said it was a secret to the universe, and he knew Graham. And I think it's just coincidence, but it's something that people are interested in, so maybe they'll do a bit of research for me.
I mean, so did you know Douglas Adams? Are you a big fan of his?
Yes, I met Douglas 2 or 3 times. I was introduced to him, I remember, on one occasion, and about 4 days later, I noticed how tall he was. I went to a party, and Graham was there, I remember, and suddenly Douglas appeared, and we had a long chat. But what surprised me was that he was towering above me. Now, I'm 6'4.5", and I was quite surprised that he seemed to have grown. But I noticed after we'd been chatting for some time, he was wearing 4-inch high heels. And I remember thinking, this is very bizarre. I've never met a very tall man who wore high heels before. But I didn't like to ask him. I didn't know whether it was a joke or what. But I subsequently knew him a little bit. He asked me to do a voice for his computer game, which he had great hopes. And apparently his friends in the computer business told him that the time of that type of game had passed, but he put an enormous amount of work into it. In fact, so much, I think he'd done so much work that he was unable to pay me for doing the voice of the bomb, but I did it anyway in exchange for a Chinese meal. And then I saw him a couple more times in London, and then he moved out to Santa Barbara and was going to work there and travel down and work with Disney a lot. But I didn't see him very much. We were not immensely close friends, just good acquaintances. And then, of course, I heard this awful business about his dying, I think, during a workout with an instructor, all right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. And I knew his wife, Jane, a little bit, liked her very much. I thought she was very interesting. She was a barrister, and they tend to be pretty smart. But that was more or less the extent to which I knew him.
And how about just in general? Are you a science fiction fan? Do you read much science fiction or watch the movies?
No, it's never interested me very much. You know, certain genres do interest people, and others don't. I'm actually genuinely fascinated by life on this planet. And in particular, whether it has any meaning, you know, whether there's anything other going on other than the sort of Richard Dawkins view of the universe as just accidental, the sort of reductionist view of science, which I think there's more going on than that. I don't think it'll ever be proved, and I think that people are born with a tendency to think there's something more than the physical, and others are born with a tendency to think that it's just the physical, you know? But I'm certainly in the first category, but I never expect to find anything like definitive truth. but it is the stuff that I'm primarily interested in. And also I'm fascinated by psychology, and that's always been the basis of almost everything that I've got deeply involved in, even what they call spiritual matters. And again, I probably would clash with all the people who think that the materialist reductionist explanation of the universe is the only one possible. But I'm reading a book right now, which I found, see if I can find it at the moment, it's among my books here, which I think is quite extraordinarily interesting. It's written by a philosopher called Thomas Nagel, Nagel, and it's called Mind and Cosmos, and the subtitle is Why the Materialist Non-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly Wrong. It's a very difficult book, but it's deeply interesting.
Well, yeah, I mean, you talk about religion somewhat in your memoir, so anyway. And you say...
I make fun of religion by and large, because I think that if there is anything going on, very few people in the organized churches know anything about it. I think they've taken ideas from religious leaders and completely lost the essence of them over the decades or centuries.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just watched your debate with Malcolm Muggeridge and Arthur Mervyn Stockwood, and those men certainly don't seem particularly wise to me.
No, I thought they were idiots. I couldn't believe when I watched it about 6 months ago. I think it was some sort of anniversary of the debate or of the release of Life of Brian. I really could hardly credit how stupid they were. It was quite a shock.
I heard Terry Jones say that was actually Douglas Adams' favorite bit of television, that he would just keep it on his VCR and play it for people over and over again.
Well, interesting. Yeah, what I was surprised is how little there was in it of any real value, because they were putting up arguments that were so patently absurd, and you could almost say they were unscientific, their attitudes, you know. And I remember Michael and I were quite astonished, and after the debate I remember going off, and I'd always rather liked Malcolm Muggeridge, who was a favourite for British television for many years, and I went and sat in the dressing room afterwards as he had his makeup taken off, and he couldn't find anything good to say about the film at all, which was recently voted the #1 British film of all time. You know, now, I don't take those polls very seriously, but if you voted #1, it's going to mean it's a pretty good film. And he thought it was absolute trash. And I remember saying to him, well, don't you think that the stuff about the Judean People's Front, the People's Front of Review, did that not amuse you? And he said, I remember he said, Dostoevsky did it much better, and the brothers Karamazov. And I thought, well, I'm going to give up.
Well, I mean, speaking of the life of Brian, there was just this Jesus and Brian conference at King's College London this year. You want to tell us about that?
Yes, I attended some of it, though unfortunately the rehearsal period for the reunion show at the O2, you know, the Python reunion, the show had become so much more complicated with the singing and the dancing that I was only able to go along to the conference on a couple of occasions, but I was fascinated to find that the serious academics there, including guys whose books I've read, I'm interested in the subject, like Bart Ehrman, they were fascinated because they said that the movie itself had actually influenced academic thought. And I found that hard to credit, but they told me absolutely genuinely that was the case. But I think that this is because people, whatever discipline they're in, get slightly stuck in the accepted norms of that discipline, you know. And when I said to one very senior cleric that it seemed to me that the Sermon on the Mount was all about trying to reduce the power of one's ego, which seems to be exactly what it's about. It doesn't say blessed are the powerful or blessed are the rich. It's not about power. It's about the opposite of power. And he found that quite revolutionary. So it's stuff I'd like to get more interested in, but I think that The fact is, anybody who thinks that the Bible was breathed into existence by God just hasn't read about the history of the Bible, and how various conferences or synods or whatever you want to call them chose which books would be the definitive version by a vote. And certain books were excluded, like the Gospel of Thomas, which I think are just rather more interesting than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of religion, I thought it was interesting in your book, you talk about how you get requests from people all the time, and that the oddest request you ever got was that someone invited you to a christening of their cat.
That's right. Quite right. Good memory. I didn't go, so I don't know. I don't know what it would have been, and it was obviously humorous, but it did become as being the most interesting. But, I get so many requests naturally. I think people think that I just sit around most of the time on my porch whittling sticks and trying to think of interesting things to do, whereas my life is actually absurdly busy and filled up with an enormous amount of stuff, which right at the moment I'm unable to contain. But if you spend 2 years writing a book, even though it has been an extraordinarily pleasant experience, much better than writing films or anything like that, and once you've done that, then you think, well, I would like people to read it, so then you're stuck with the publicity, most of which is okay, but there's just a lot of it.
Well, I mean, actually, at that conference, you described the press. Wait, can I find the quote? I think as second-rate scum. Oh, yeah. When you deal with the media, you have no idea what second-rate scum they are. I mean, what sort of experiences with the media have you had that makes you say that?
Well, I would say largely poor. I never seems to have any real contact with the British media without emerging from it feeling slightly soiled. These are not people, by and large, to be trusted. And even if the individual journalist is sent out, and a couple of very nice young men interviewed me and really listened to what I had to say and asked very interesting questions, then they will find that their copy has been changed by editors. And I have a reputation in England from the papers of being quite difficult and grumpy and prickly and all this kind of thing. And one of the reviews of the book said Cleese is surprisingly gracious. And I wanted to say, my friends weren't surprised by the book because actually they know me. And the people who are surprised are people who bought this image of me that has been foisted on me by the British press for the simple reason I have such a low opinion of them. So they're hardly likely to have a high opinion of me.
I mean, what do you think makes for a really good interview? Do you think in your book you mentioned David Frost did some really good interviews with Major Mike Hoare and Emile Savundra? I mean, just as an interview, I'm just curious what makes, in your opinion, for a really good interview?
Well, I think there's two essential components. The first thing is that if it's a radio or television interview, that the interviewer is himself relaxed. If the interviewer is relaxed, it's almost impossible to do a bad interview. If the interviewer is not relaxed, then it's almost impossible to do a good interview. And the second thing is I think that he should, or she should, be genuinely interested in the book and want to know more about certain aspects of it. And it's nice when people ask about different aspects. Some people are interested in the content, some people are interested in the process. Some are interested in my first reactions to the learning that I'm in the publishing world and how the publishing world works. You know that, for example, I learned about 3 weeks ago that 90% of celebrity autobiographies are not written by the celebrity. 90% of them are ghostwritten. I had no idea the figure was so high. So different interviewers ask different things, which is, really rather fun.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, some stuff from the book that really struck me is you have a couple of things that sort of say what some of the inspirations were for Holy Grail and for Life of Brian. You say one of your earliest memories was of being attacked by a rabbit, and of course that makes me think of Holy Grail. But you don't say that was an influence on it. Was that the scene in Holy Grail?
No, I don't think that was the reason for it. I mean, I wasn't attacked by a rabbit. That was an attempt to be humorous. I was nibbled. I think I used the phrase, I was nibbled by a rabbit. But I was just talking about the very small number of things that one really remembers from one's early childhood. And I gave that as a, I hope, humorous example of the triviality of most of one's memories.
Mm-hmm. But you did say, so the Black Knight scene, you said, was inspired by a lesson that one of your teachers told you when you were young?
That's right, yes. A lovely guy called Jumper G, who died at the age of 101 and who managed to fight in both world wars. I never came across anyone who did that. He was a good teacher of English, and I liked him enormously. And he would go off on these wonderful excursions where there were nothing to do with the subject he was teaching. And he told the story about a wrestling match that had taken place in ancient Rome, and it took place apparently in a private house because there wasn't any television in those days, as I think even young American males realized. And as a result of that, one of the entertainments they'd sometimes put on was to get professional wrestlers in to fight. And there was a particularly tough contest in progress, and one of the wrestlers, the arm broke. The difficulty of the embrace was so great that his arm broke under the pressure, and he submitted because of the appalling pain he was in. And the referee sort of disentangled them and said to the other guy, "You won," and the other guy was rather unresponsive, and the referee realized the other guy was dead. And this was an example to Jumper G of the fact that if you didn't give up, you couldn't lose. And I always thought this was a very dodgy conclusion. But it stuck in my mind for years. And so probably, I don't know, 15 years later, when I was writing for the Holy Grail with Graham, I talked to him about that, and that's where the Black Knight sketch came from.
Yeah. So that was great. And then another one that really jumped out at me is you say that the scene in Life of Brian where Brian is forced to write his slogan all over the walls of the palace was inspired by an experience you had as a teacher.
Oh, yes, I linked that as an example, but in the schools that I was at, it was quite normal in those days. If you were caught guilty of some misdemeanor, you would be asked to write out lines so many times. I remember having Mr. Dolman, the Reverend Dolman, was caught me being very noisy once, and I had to write out "Silence is golden" 100 times. It was a standard, pretty humane punishment. So that was where the idea of writing something out came from, and then I kind of offered humor is gained if you allow two frameworks of different ideas to overlap. And so when the policeman catches him writing out a slogan and he tells him to write it out 100 times, I thought it was a rather funny idea. But most ideas, you see, come from the unconscious. I think people are always fascinated when there's a kind of logical connection. And they say, "Oh, I now understand where the idea came from," but it's rather misleading because the unconscious is what produces the unexpected. I lecture on the creativity, and I point out that if you could be creative by applying ordinary logic, then anyone who was logical could do it. And the answer is they can't. There are some extraordinary logical people who actually are not terribly good at being creative. Creativity comes from the unconscious. That's where most of the really unusual and special ideas come from. And in my lecture on creativity, I explain how you can get in contact with your own unconscious. But if you take someone like Edison, who was a pretty extraordinary scientist, he had a particular methodology, it's early morning, to his inventions. And he thought that he got his best inventions when he was on the verge of falling asleep. And he used to sit in a chair holding ball bearings in his hand and with a brass bowl under his hands, so that when he fell asleep, he dropped the ball bearings, and the noise would wake him up. And that way, he could spend quite a long period of time on that, in that sort of twilight area between being very tired and actually falling asleep. And that's when he said he got most of his ideas. Now, that's clearly not relying on logic.
Okay, we did have some listener questions that I wanted to get to. So our listener,
Sure.
Juan San Miguel says, ask what it was like to do his cameo in Doctor Who in the 1979 story City of Death. To my knowledge, I've never seen him comment on that, and I think he's the only member of Monty Python to appear on Doctor Who.
I think that's probably the case. I was asked, I think it came through Douglas. I think Douglas Adams was at that point involved in the script writing of Doctor Who. I think it was he who asked me if I would do a day, and I was delighted to find it was with an actress called Eleanor Bron, who I was a great admirer of. And we got on well, and that's all I can remember about it. I don't think I've seen the episode since literally the day when I made it. But it was nice to have been part of Doctor Who, although, again, not being a sci-fi fan, I've hardly ever seen any episodes, but I've met one or two of the Doctor Who's, including Tom Baker.
Okay, and so then Gribble Garcia asks, what was it like working on the Elder Scrolls Online, and did you get to work with any of the other actors that were involved with the game, such as Malcolm McDowell or Kate Beckinsale?
No, when you do those, when you're recording voices for, let's say, major animation movies, like Shrek, where I played the king, you just record on your own. You never ever meet the other actors at all. I mean, I did 2 or 3 Shreks, but I never met Eddie Murphy, who I think is quite wonderful as that donkey. Except that there was a big publicity photograph. When the movie came out, we all had to get together, and there was one photograph, and I think I was in it with him. But you just don't spot anyone. The only occasion was once the Shrek people, they're a very smart bunch, and they know what they're doing. I love working with them because they really know what they're doing, and that's relatively unusual in this business. Just for publicity purposes, they wanted to get a little bit of film of me working with Julie Andrews, who played the Queen, to my king, and they brought a camera along and they shot us recording together, but it was a completely unique experience. 99% of the time, you're just there on your own.
Mm-hmm. And do you play any video games yourself? Do you have any impressions of them?
No, I would like to. There have been several things in life that I liked a lot, but I've always suspected that if I started doing them, too much time would disappear down that particular avenue. For example, chess. I could have become quite obsessional about chess. I loved it, and crosswords and things like that. But frankly, the life that I still lead, even at my ripe age of 75, is too busy to allow those kind of things. And my greatest love is reading. So when I do get a little bit of time off, I almost invariably spend it reading.
Yeah, I know you're busy now, too, on this new movie, Absolutely Anything. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
No, we don't know anything about it. Terry Jones said to us about 18 months ago, he just contacted us individually because we very seldom get together, and said, would you do a voice for it? And so we, liking Terry and enjoying his works, I said, yes, of course. And in due course, they contacted our agent, a deal was made, and then round about the time of rehearsing the two, I was asked if I would go in the studio. When I was there, I was delighted to find Terry was there, and he handed me some bits of script, and I just recorded the words. There were 1 or 2 occasions actually with him, but normally he was just telling me how he wanted words read, and I read them and went home and haven't heard a word about it since.
Well, and speaking of Douglas Adams again, it says on Wikipedia that Douglas Adams read this script because it's been around for so long, and that he said the dog was the funniest part.
Oh, I didn't know that. But certainly it's been around a long time.
All right, well, looking forward to seeing that. So in So Anyway, you say at the end that maybe you should stick to writing books from now on. Do you think that's what you'll do now? Do you think you'll write some more books?
Well, one of the things I write about in the book, basically the book is about me. In fact, I was terribly amused that one critic in London criticized the book for being self-absorbed. And I sort of had the feeling that was probably the point of an autobiography. Maybe when I write the next autobiography, he wants me to write it about someone else. But people are reading the book are reading it because they think I'm funny, and they're in some strange way interested in me and my mind and what led me into comedy and what led me into this kind of comedy or that kind of comedy, and what it was like to write with people like Peter Sellers, who was the greatest comedian in the world at the time I worked with him. And if they're interested in that kind of thing, they'll be interested in the processes and the thoughts, and also there's a little bit in there about my emotional life, where I think it's interesting, because I think most of life is actually relatively boring, and I do try very hard not to be boring. So I keep changing the subject, but there's a lot in it about comedy, and I think people who are interested in comedy will find that some of the things I have to say are unusual.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, this book follows your life up to the point basically at which Monty Python started. Do you have any plans to write about write more about later periods?
Oh, yes, I should write about the next bit, but there seemed to be an awful lot in my life because I did appear in Broadway musicals, and that was an interesting experience. I was at Cambridge, and I did shows there with Chapman and people like Brooke Taylor, and Bill Oddie, and of course Eric Idle, and people are interested in that. And then I toured the world. I did a tour in New Zealand, and there's quite a lot about that. Then I was living in America for a year and a half. There are all my thoughts about that, and being in a Broadway musical where I was not allowed to sing because I sing so badly. And then I got back and started my career in television and worked with Martin Feldman a lot, which was an extremely interesting experience. And he was very funny off camera too. And then leading its feet slowly up through working with Peter Sellers and people like that, David Frost, up to working with the Pythons. And there's an extra chapter on the end about the O2 show, the reunion, that happened a few months ago. I think it was July, because people are interested in that. And I contrast how Monty Python was at the beginning with how this vast and hugely successful show was actually done at the end, God knows how many years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a great book. I really enjoyed it. Is there anything, we're pretty much out of time here. Is there anything else you wanted to mention? Any other projects or anything else?
Well, I'd just like to say that most of the interviews that I do, people are asking about things like relationships, but the primary purpose of the book's to make people laugh. And I think there are stories in there that are as funny as any I've told, like the one about the guy killing the rabbit out of humane reasons because the poor thing was dying of myxomatosis. So there are some stories like that. So I think are the funniest things I've written for 20 years.
All right, so unfortunately we're all out of time, so I think we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with John.
Yes, you're right. That's right. I just need a few minutes before the next one. It's funny. Talking on the phone is a little more tiring than face-to-face. I think it's because one's not getting the usual non-verbal signals that you get when you're actually chatting to someone in a radio studio. But anyway, if you're happy with that, I am.
Okay, great. So John Cleese, thanks so much for joining us.
Great pleasure. I hope it was interesting.
Yep.
Best wishes.
Okay, take care.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you. And that was our interview. So big thanks again to John Cleese for being our guest today. And of course, a very special thank you to all of our crowdfunders. Today's show was made possible thanks to support from listeners such as Steven Segarian, Bruno Onkier, Jonathan Pottle, Kurt Donaldson, R. Chris Four, Scott Osterling, and John Marshall. So thanks guys, we really appreciate it. To learn more, visit us at geeksguideshow.com and click on crowdfunding. And be sure to join us next week as we interview David Cronenberg, director of such films as Videodrome, Existence, and A History of Violence. You'll notice that that's 2 interviews in a row. Our original plan was to alternate between interviews and panels, but this past week we got the chance to speak with both John Cleese and David Cronenberg, and obviously we didn't want to pass up either of them. So we decided to record both interviews and run them back to back. I think that from now on we'll probably stick to an alternating schedule less and less. and instead decide whether each episode will be an interview or a panel based on which topic or guest we're most excited about at the moment. The more popular the podcast becomes, the more chances we get to interview well-known guests, so it's likely that in the future we'll be running interviews a bit more often than panels, but we'll see how it goes. As always, you can send us feedback at geeksgalaxy@gmail.com. Alright, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.